The man behind the sharpest critique and the life he thought he knew, Simon Cowell, was known across the world as a man who could silence a room with a glance. His reputation was built on precision, blunt honesty, and an almost unshakable confidence in judgment. For decades, he occupied the center of the entertainment industry, shaping careers and breaking dreams in equal measure. Whether on Pop Idol, American Idol, The X Factor, or Britain's Got Talent, he became a symbol of uncompromising standards. Audiences tuned in not just for talent, but for his reactions, the raised eyebrow, the dismissive pause, the rare nod of approval that could change someone's life. Behind that persona was a businessman who understood television like few others, building psycho-entertainment into a powerful force in music and TV production. His life was structured, controlled, and entirely oriented around work. Long days blurred into longer nights, filled with meetings, auditions, editing rooms, and flights between countries. He once believed that this rhythm defined him completely, leaving little room for anything else. Family life was not something he actively rejected, but it was something he never prioritized, convinced that his world was already full. Yet beneath that polished certainty, life was quietly moving toward a shift he could not anticipate. The foundation of his identity, control, judgment, and detachment would soon be tested in ways no stage, audience, or career success could prepare him for. What came next was not another career challenge, but a deeply personal transformation that would strip away everything he thought mattered and replace it with something far more fragile, unpredictable, and human. When personal choices collided with public attention, everything began to shift in 2013, when Simon Cowell's private life became the subject of intense public scrutiny. His relationship with Lauren Silverman emerged while she was still legally married to Andrew Silverman, a close acquaintance of Simon's. The situation quickly escalated into a media storm when Andrew filed for divorce, citing adultery and naming Simon in the proceedings. What might have remained a private matter for others became global entertainment news within days. Headlines spread rapidly, dissecting every detail of the situation, turning personal decisions into public discussion. Despite the chaos, the legal matter was eventually settled privately, avoiding courtroom exposure. But the emotional and reputational ripple effects lingered far longer than the settlement itself. Soon after, it was confirmed that Lauren was expecting Simon's child, adding another layer of complexity to an already highly publicized situation. For someone accustomed to controlling narratives in entertainment, Simon suddenly found himself inside one he could not shape. The world that once reacted to his judgments was now judging him. Yet amid the noise, something unexpected was forming beneath the surface. The idea of fatherhood, once distant and unnecessary in his mind, began to take root in a way he could not ignore. The transition from observer to participant in family life had begun, even if he did not fully understand it yet. What had started as controversy would eventually become the beginning of a personal transformation far deeper than anything his career had ever demanded. The birth that rewrote his identity. On February 14, 2014, Simon Cowell's son, Eric Philip Cowell, was born, a moment that would quietly redefine the entire structure of his life. Valentine's Day, often associated with symbolic expressions of love, became the day Simon experienced a form of attachment he had never anticipated. For years, he had openly dismissed the idea of becoming a father, convinced that his lifestyle and personality left little room for it. He valued independence, routine control, and professional focus above all else. But the moment he saw the first scan of his unborn son, something subtle yet irreversible began to shift. Later, he admitted that he felt a connection he could not explain, one that bypassed logic and expectation. The birth itself marked not just the arrival of a child, but the beginning of a new emotional framework for Simon. Naming his son Eric Philip Cowell carried deep significance, honoring Simon's late father and reinforcing a sense of generational continuity. In that choice alone, something changed. Legacy replaced routine ambition. In the days following Eric's birth, Simon's priorities began to reorganize themselves quietly. Work, once absolute, started to share space with something more delicate and unfamiliar. The man who once measured success in ratings and audience reactions began noticing smaller things: feeding schedules, sleep patterns, tiny expressions that carried meaning he had never paid attention to before. Without announcing any change, his internal world had already begun to reorganize itself around a new center of gravity: a father learning to see beyond fame. As Eric grew in his early months and years, Simon Cowell gradually found himself stepping into a role he had never rehearsed. Fatherhood did not arrive as a dramatic shift, but as a series of small, persistent adjustments that slowly redefined his daily existence. He began reshaping his schedule, declining certain professional commitments that required long absences, and prioritizing time at home more than ever before. The man who once thrived in constant movement and public exposure started to find value in stillness and routine. Bedtime stories, morning routines, and simple moments of presence became more meaningful than any television appearance or production milestone. Yet this transformation was not without internal tension. Simon was still deeply embedded in an industry that demanded attention, judgment, and availability. Balancing that with the needs of a growing child required a level of emotional recalibration he had never experienced before. Eric became the quiet center of his decisions, even when work pressures attempted to pull him in the opposite direction. Friends and colleagues noticed subtle changes: a slight softening in tone, a more measured approach to scheduling, a reluctance to overextend himself. But what they saw was only the surface. Beneath it was a man slowly learning that influence and success meant little if they came at the cost of presence. Fatherhood was no longer an abstract idea. It had become the lens through which he began to interpret everything else in his life. Early signs that could not be ignored. As Eric entered toddlerhood, Simon began noticing patterns that were difficult to dismiss. At first, these observations were subtle, small behavioral differences that could easily be attributed to normal developmental variation, but over time, they became more consistent and harder to ignore. Eric was quieter than other children his age, often engaging more with objects and patterns than with verbal interaction. While other children began forming words and experimenting with language, Eric remained largely non-verbal. Simon, initially reassured by common advice that children develop at different rates, tried to avoid drawing conclusions too quickly. However, his instincts, honed over years of reading people in professional settings, began to signal that something deeper might be present. He also noticed how Eric reacted to sensory environments. Loud noises, bright lights, and crowded spaces often seemed overwhelming, causing visible discomfort. These moments were not isolated, and their repetition began to shape Simon's understanding of his son's experience of the world. Despite concern, there was no panic, only a growing sense of attentiveness. Simon started observing more carefully, not out of fear, but out of a desire to understand. Nights became periods of reflection, where he would quietly consider patterns, behaviors, and possibilities. The idea that Eric might simply experience the world differently began to take shape in his mind. This was not a narrative of limitation, but of difference, something that required awareness rather than assumption. The early signs did not define Eric, but they did begin to reshape how Simon approached fatherhood itself, when understanding becomes responsibility. As time passed, Simon Cowell found himself increasingly engaged in learning about child development, not as an abstract concept but as a personal necessity. He began reading extensively, researching developmental milestones, and consulting with professionals to better understand what he was observing in Eric. This was not driven by fear alone, but by responsibility, the need to ensure he was responding appropriately as a parent. What he discovered was not a simple explanation, but a spectrum of possibilities that required patience and careful interpretation. Eric demonstrated moments of remarkable focus and intelligence, particularly in structured or pattern-based activities. Yet communication remained distinct from typical developmental paths, relying more on behavior and nonverbal expression than spoken language. Simon slowly began reframing his expectations, shifting away from standardized milestones toward more individualized understanding. Instead of asking whether Eric was, quote, on track, he began asking how Eric experienced the world. This change in perspective marked a significant emotional transition. It moved him away from comparison and toward acceptance of difference as a valid form of development. At the same time, it required emotional adjustment, as letting go of conventional expectations is never easy for a parent. Still, Simon remained committed to learning and adapting. His approach became more observational, more patient, and less influenced by external assumptions. What mattered most was not alignment with typical timelines, but Eric's comfort, growth, and sense of security within his environment. In that shift, fatherhood became something far more complex and meaningful than he had ever imagined. The world watches while he quietly changes. Public perception of Simon Cowell remained largely unchanged during this period, even as his private life was undergoing profound transformation. To audiences, he was still the same figure known for sharp critiques and television dominance. Appearances on shows like Britain's Got Talent continued, maintaining the familiar image of authority and control. However, behind the scenes, a very different reality was unfolding. Eric occasionally appeared in public moments, including a widely recognized instance on stage during Britain's Got Talent, where he pressed the golden buzzer in a carefully managed environment. While the moment appeared spontaneous to viewers, it had been thoughtfully structured to ensure Eric's comfort. Every detail, from lighting to sound levels, was considered in advance. These adjustments reflected a deeper shift in Simon's priorities, one that extended far beyond public perception. He was no longer simply participating in entertainment, he was actively redesigning his life around his son's needs. The media began noting subtle changes, describing him as softened or more emotionally present, but these labels barely captured the depth of what was happening internally. This was not a surface-level transformation but a restructuring of identity itself. Work decisions were filtered through personal considerations in ways they had never been before. Public appearances became less frequent, not due to withdrawal from the industry, but due to recalibration of priorities. The world continued to see the television personality, but Simon himself was increasingly living in a different reality, one defined not by audience reaction, but by his son's experience of safety and understanding. Behind closed doors and growing awareness. As Eric continued to grow, Simon's awareness of his son's needs deepened, leading to more structured involvement with specialists and developmental professionals. This phase of their journey was marked by observation, patience, and gradual understanding rather than immediate answers. Sessions with experts provided insight into sensory processing, communication differences, and behavioral patterns, helping Simon contextualize what he had been observing at home. Rather than seeking to fix anything, the focus shifted towards support and adaptation. Home life began to reflect this evolving understanding, with routines becoming more structured and environments adjusted to reduce sensory overload. Even simple daily activities were carefully considered to ensure comfort and predictability for Eric. Simon's professional life continued, but at a reduced intensity, as he increasingly prioritized stability at home. What became clear during this time was that parenting, for him, was no longer about maintaining balance between work and family. It was about redefining balance entirely. The idea of success shifted from external achievement to internal stability and emotional security for his child. Each small breakthrough in communication or comfort became meaningful in a way that professional accomplishments no longer matched. This phase was not defined by crisis, but by adaptation. It was a slow, ongoing process of learning how to support a child whose experience of the world required patience, attention, and deep emotional presence. When silence became a language of its own. As Eric grew older, Simon Cowell began to understand something that no amount of professional experience had ever prepared him for. Communication does not always depend on words. In the entertainment world, Simon had spent decades listening for voices that could carry across stages, believing expression was tied to speech, performance, and presence. But at home, with Eric, he was learning a completely different vocabulary. Silence was not absence, it was communication in a form he had never been trained to interpret. Eric's way of interacting with the world came through gestures, patterns, repetition, and focused attention rather than spoken language. At first, this required patience, but over time it demanded something deeper, retraining instinct itself. Simon began noticing subtle cues that others might overlook, the way Eric positioned objects, the comfort he found in routine, and the calm he displayed in structured environments. These were not signs of limitation, but of internal order. The more Simon observed, the more he realized that understanding his son meant stepping away from traditional definitions of development. Instead of asking why Eric did not speak in expected ways, he began asking how Eric was already expressing himself. This shift changed everything. It reduced frustration and replaced it with curiosity. It also reshaped Simon's emotional responses, allowing him to meet Eric where he was instead of where the world expected him to be. In that silence, a new kind of dialogue emerged, one built not on words, but on recognition, trust, and emotional awareness that required no translation at all. The emotional weight of letting expectations go. One of the most difficult transformations Simon Cowell experienced was not logistical, but emotional. Letting go of expectations he had unknowingly carried for years proved far more challenging than any professional decision he had ever made. Before Eric's diagnosis, Simon had a quiet vision of fatherhood shaped by familiar milestones, spoken conversations, shared humor, school stories, and effortless dialogue. These were not demands, but assumptions shaped by cultural norms. When reality unfolded differently, he found himself navigating an internal process of grief that was subtle but persistent. It was not grief for Eric himself, but for imagined futures that no longer applied. At times, this emotional adjustment surfaced unexpectedly, often during ordinary moments when comparisons became unavoidable. Yet over time, Simon learned that holding on to those expectations only created distance between him and his son. Releasing them allowed space for something more authentic to emerge. Instead of measuring progress against external benchmarks, he began recognizing smaller, more personal forms of growth. A moment of shared attention, a calm response to a familiar environment, or a sign of comfort in routine became meaningful indicators of connection. This reframing did not eliminate emotional difficulty, but it softened it. It allowed Simon to transition from expectation-based parenting to presence-based parenting. In doing so, he discovered that acceptance is not a single moment of realization, but an ongoing process of adjustment. Each time he released an old assumption, he made room for a deeper understanding of who Eric truly was, independent of comparison or societal expectation. Redefining strength beyond public image. For much of his life, Simon Cowell had been defined by control, decisiveness, and public authority. Strength, in his professional world, meant certainty, knowing exactly what worked and what did not. However, fatherhood introduced a version of strength that did not rely on control at all. Instead, it demanded flexibility, emotional openness, and the willingness to adapt without guaranteed outcomes. Caring for Eric required Simon to step away from the image he had carefully constructed in public life. The man known for judgment and precision was now required to embrace uncertainty and patience. This shift did not happen instantly, but gradually, through repeated experiences that challenged his assumptions. Each time he adjusted a routine, restructured a plan, or responded differently to Eric's needs, he was redefining what strength meant in practice. It was no longer about authority over others, but responsibility toward another person's well-being. This internal shift also changed how he viewed vulnerability. What once might have been seen as weakness became essential to connection. Allowing himself to feel uncertainty, concern, and emotional sensitivity became part of his role as a father. In this way, strength evolved from external dominance into internal resilience. Simon was not becoming less capable, he was becoming more aware, and in that awareness he found a form of stability that was quieter but far more enduring than anything fame or success had previously provided. Fatherhood had not weakened his identity, it had expanded it into something more human, grounded, and emotionally present, building a future without fixed definitions. As Eric continued to grow, Simon Cowell gradually learned to release fixed ideas about the future. Instead of projecting long-term expectations based on traditional developmental paths, he began focusing on adaptability. This shift was not about lowering aspirations, but about redefining what progress meant in a more individualized way. Planning for Eric's future required flexibility, not certainty. It meant recognizing that growth does not always follow predictable timelines or familiar patterns. With professional guidance, Simon explored approaches that prioritized comfort, communication development, and sensory understanding. Each step forward was measured not by comparison to others, but by Eric's own sense of progress and stability. This approach required constant recalibration. What worked one month might need adjustment the next, depending on Eric's evolving needs. For Simon, this became a lesson in patience at a scale he had never experienced before. It also reshaped his understanding of achievement itself. Success was no longer defined by external validation or public recognition, but by consistency in support and emotional security. In practical terms, this meant creating systems that allowed Eric to feel safe while still encouraging gradual development. In emotional terms, it meant accepting uncertainty as a permanent part of parenting rather than something to overcome. Over time, this mindset brought a quieter form of confidence, one rooted not in control over outcomes, but in trust in the process itself. It was a future no longer defined by fixed expectations, but by continuous learning and adaptation. The quiet transformation behind closed doors. While public attention continued to focus on Simon Cowell's career, the most significant changes in his life were happening away from cameras and audiences. Behind closed doors, his daily routine had been completely restructured around Eric's needs. This transformation was not dramatic in appearance, but profound in impact. The household environment was carefully adjusted to reduce sensory stress and encourage calmness. Daily schedules were designed with consistency in mind, ensuring predictability in a world that could otherwise feel overwhelming. Therapy sessions, structured activities, and quiet time became integral parts of life. These adjustments required ongoing attention and commitment as Eric's needs evolved over time. What stood out most during this period was the level of focus required to maintain balance. Every decision, no matter how small, carried weight because it contributed to overall stability. Simon's professional life, though still active, became secondary to this internal restructuring. He was no longer operating within two separate worlds, public and private, but within a single system where family needs shaped everything else. This transition also revealed a different side of him, one less associated with performance and more with care and consistency. The transformation was not about abandoning his career, but about redefining priorities in a way that placed emotional well-being at the center. Over time, this private evolution became the most important work of his life, even if it remained largely unseen by the outside world. A life rebuilt around quiet structure. Following growing clarity about Eric's needs, Simon Cowell began restructuring his home life to create an environment centered on stability and predictability. This transformation was not dramatic in appearance, but extensive in execution. Spaces were modified to reduce sensory intensity, routines were established to provide consistency, and daily life became carefully organized around Eric's comfort. The home evolved into a controlled, calm environment where unpredictability was minimized. This shift required significant personal adjustment, as Simon's previous lifestyle had been defined by spontaneity, travel, and constant change. Now, even small decisions were made with careful consideration of their impact on Eric's experience. Social interactions, outings, and even family visits were planned in advance to ensure they would not create distress. While this level of structure might have felt restrictive in another context, for Simon it became a form of purpose. He was no longer navigating life as an individual, but as a parent, responsible for creating safety and understanding. The emotional weight of this responsibility was significant, but it was also grounding. In focusing on consistency, Simon found a new rhythm that replaced the unpredictability of his earlier life. The change also brought emotional reflection, as he began to understand how much of parenting is about adaptation rather than expectation. Each adjustment, no matter how small, contributed to a larger framework designed to support Eric's growth and well-being in a world that often moves too quickly to accommodate difference. The moment everything became clear. A turning point came during a family trip when Eric was around 4 years old. What was intended as a relaxing experience quickly revealed the extent to which unfamiliar environments could overwhelm him. The resort setting, filled with noise, activity, and unpredictability, created significant sensory challenges for Eric. Over the course of the trip, it became increasingly clear that these responses were not isolated incidents, but part of a consistent pattern. One evening, during a busy dinner setting filled with sound and movement, Eric became visibly overwhelmed, covering his ears and withdrawing from interaction. Despite attempts to comfort him, the situation highlighted a deeper need for understanding and professional guidance. That night, Simon and Lauren made the decision to seek specialist evaluation, not out of alarm, but out of responsibility. They recognized that supporting Eric effectively required deeper insight. This moment did not mark fear, but clarity. It was the point at which observation turned into action. The experience reframed their understanding of parenting, not as instinct alone, but as a willingness to learn and adapt based on a child's individual needs. It also marked the beginning of a more structured journey toward understanding Eric's developmental profile. What had previously been a series of observations now became a focused effort to provide appropriate support, guided by professionals who could help interpret what they were witnessing. Understanding autism and acceptance. In December 2018, Simon Cowell received confirmation that Eric was on the autism spectrum. The diagnosis provided clarity, but it did not fundamentally change how Simon viewed his son. Instead, it gave structure to observations he had already made over time. Autism spectrum disorder explained patterns in communication, sensory response, and behavior that had previously been uncertain. However, what stood out most to Simon was not the label itself, but the emphasis on individuality within it. He learned that autism was not a limitation in the traditional sense, but a different way of processing and experiencing the world. This understanding reframed everything. Eric was not defined by absence, but by difference, an important distinction that shaped how Simon approached parenting moving forward. With professional guidance, he began focusing on therapies and support systems designed to enhance communication, comfort, and daily functioning. At the same time, he became increasingly aware of the importance of avoiding comparison with typical developmental expectations. The goal was not normalization, but empowerment. This period also brought emotional reflection, as Simon adjusted his expectations of fatherhood. However,